What I'm about to reveal in this video has been kept quiet by a select group of aircraft owners and pilots for years. While most aviators are draining their bank accounts every time their engine hits TBO, there's a small percentage who haven't written a check for a major overhaul in over a decade. And no, they're not flying on borrowed time or cutting corners on safety. In fact, their aircraft are often in better condition than those coming straight out of certified overhaul shops. The insurance companies know about them. The FAA has the data, but almost nobody talks about what's really happening here, and the reason why might shock you. By the end of this video, you'll understand why some of the smartest aircraft owners you've never heard of are operating on a completely different financial playing field, and why the traditional overhaul cycle that's been drilled into every pilot's head might be one of the most expensive myths in general aviation. Stay with me, because what you're about to learn could literally save you tens of thousands of dollars, and I'm going to walk you through exactly how this works, step by step, with no fluff and no holding back. Let me start by saying this up front. Everything I'm sharing here is completely legal, fully documented, and in many cases actually results in safer aircraft operations than the conventional approach most pilots follow blindly. But here's the thing. The aviation industry has a vested interest in keeping you on a very specific maintenance schedule. And I'm not talking about conspiracy theories here. I'm talking about pure economics and how the system is designed to extract maximum revenue from aircraft owners who don't know there are alternatives. The certified overhaul shops, the engine manufacturers, even some of the training organizations are all part of an ecosystem that benefits tremendously when you show up at TBO with a checkbook in hand, ready to spend anywhere from $40,000 to $70,000, sometimes more, to have your engine torn down and rebuilt. And look, I'm not saying overhauls aren't necessary in some cases. They absolutely are. But what if I told you that the mandatory nature of this cycle, the way it's presented as inevitable and non-negotiable, is actually not supported by the data in a huge number of scenarios? Here's where it gets interesting. There's a fundamental difference between what the regulations actually require and what the industry culture has convinced us is required. Most pilots believe that when their engine reaches the manufacturer's recommended TBO, which is typically somewhere between 1,200 and 2,000 hours, depending on the engine model, they must overhaul it. They've been told this by their instructors, their mechanics, their insurance agents, and it's repeated so often that it becomes gospel. But here's the truth that changes everything. For aircraft operated under Part 91, which covers the vast majority of general aviation flying, TBO is not a legal requirement. Read that again. It's not legally mandated. The manufacturer recommends it, and that recommendation carries weight, but it's not an airworthiness directive, and it's not an FAA regulation that you can be violated for ignoring, as long as you're operating under the right conditions. Now, before you think I'm advocating for running engines into the ground, let me explain what the smart operators are doing instead, because this is where the real strategy comes in. The pilots who never pay for overhauls anymore, or at least pay far less frequently, have figured out a system that's built on three core principles. First, they understand the actual regulatory framework better than the average pilot. Second, they've implemented a monitoring and maintenance program that's often more rigorous than what most owners do. And third, they've shifted their entire approach from time-based maintenance to condition-based maintenance, which is exactly how the airlines and commercial operators have been doing it for decades. The airlines don't overhaul their engines based solely on hours. They monitor them constantly, track specific parameters, and make decisions based on actual engine condition rather than arbitrary time limits. And there's a pathway for general aviation aircraft owners to do essentially the same thing, but almost nobody knows about it or takes advantage of it. Let me break down what's actually happening in the real world. When you operate under Part 91 for personal flying, the regulations are incredibly flexible compared to commercial operations. The FAA requires that your aircraft be maintained in an airworthy condition, which means it must conform to its type certificate and be in a condition for safe operation. That's the standard. Now, the manufacturer's recommended TBO is a guideline that was established under specific test conditions, often with significant safety margins built in, and it's designed to cover the widest possible range of operating conditions and pilot behaviors. But if you're operating your aircraft in a way that's less demanding than those worst-case scenarios, maintaining it meticulously and monitoring it closely, the engine can often continue operating safely well beyond TBO. The key is documentation, monitoring, and having a mechanic who understands this approach and is willing to work with you. Here's the system that these informed operators use. They start with oil analysis, but not just the basic oil analysis that most pilots do once a year and then forget about. They're sending samples every 25 hours, sometimes every single oil change, and they're tracking trends over time. They're looking at metal content, viscosity, contamination, and they're comparing each report to the baseline they've established for their specific engine. When you have 50 or 60 oil analysis reports for a single engine, you start to see patterns that are invisible to someone who only checks occasionally. You can see when bearing wear starts to increase, when combustion byproducts change, when something is beginning to develop long before it becomes a problem. This kind of data-driven approach gives you predictive information that a calendar or hour meter simply cannot provide. And this is exactly what the commercial operators do with their engines, except they have even more sophisticated monitoring systems. The second component is bore scope inspections. These pilots are having their cylinders inspected regularly, not just at annual inspections, but sometimes twice a year, or whenever there's any indication of a potential issue. A bore scope allows you to look inside the cylinders without disassembly, to check for scoring, cracking, valve condition, carbon buildup, and all the things that would normally require pulling cylinders to see. When you combine regular bore scope data with oil analysis trends, you're building a comprehensive picture of engine health that's far more accurate than simply counting hours. If your cylinders look great at 1,500 hours, your oil analysis is clean, your compression checks are solid, and the engine is running smoothly with no abnormal indications, what exactly are you overhauling? You're essentially tearing down a healthy engine and replacing parts that still have significant useful life remaining, all because a number on your tach hit a particular threshold. Now here's where the financial piece becomes absolutely critical, and this is something that will completely change how you think about aircraft ownership. A traditional overhaul on a 6-cylinder Continental or Lycoming engine is going to run you somewhere between $50,000 and $75,000 at a reputable shop. That's assuming nothing unusual is found and you're not doing any major upgrades. If you're flying 100 hours a year, which is pretty typical for owner-flown aircraft, you're hitting TBO every 12 to 20 years depending on your engine. That means you're budgeting roughly $3,000 to $6,000 per year just for the eventual overhaul. But if you can extend your engine's operational life through condition monitoring and targeted maintenance, running it to 1,800 hours, 2,000 hours, or even beyond in some cases, you're spreading that cost over more years and more flight hours. But here's the part that's even more powerful. Many of these informed operators aren't doing traditional field overhauls at all. When something does eventually need attention, they're doing top overhauls, replacing cylinders as needed, or addressing specific issues rather than automatically doing a complete teardown. Let me give you a real-world example that illustrates this perfectly. There's an aircraft owner I know who's been flying the same engine for over 17 years now. His engine has about 1,900 hours on it, well past the manufacturer's recommended TBO of 1,800 hours. He operates under Part 91, flies consistently, maintains his aircraft meticulously, and has been doing oil analysis every 25 hours for the entire life of the engine. His mechanic performs bore scope inspections every 6 months. About 3 years ago, one cylinder started showing slightly elevated wear metals in the oil analysis, and the bore scope revealed some minor scoring. Instead of overhauling the entire engine, they pulled that one cylinder, sent it out for repair, and reinstalled it. Cost? About $4,000, including labor. The engine is still running beautifully, all parameters are normal, and he saved himself probably $60,000 compared to what a full overhaul would have cost at TBO. His insurance company has never questioned it because his maintenance records are impeccable and the aircraft is demonstrably airworthy. This is not an isolated case. This is a strategy that experienced aircraft owners use all the time, but it requires knowledge, discipline, and a relationship with a mechanic who understands condition-based maintenance. The aviation insurance aspect is something that confuses a lot of people, so let me clear this up right now. Many pilots believe their insurance will be invalidated or their coverage will be dropped if they operate past TBO. In most cases under Part 91 operations, this is simply not true. Insurance companies care about airworthiness and whether the aircraft is being maintained properly. If you have detailed maintenance records, regular inspections, oil analysis data showing healthy trends, and an A&P mechanic who's willing to sign off on the annual inspection confirming the aircraft is airworthy, most insurance companies will continue coverage without issue. Now, some insurance companies may have specific policies, and some may require additional documentation or slightly higher premiums for aircraft beyond TBO, but the blanket statement that you can't get insurance is false. The key is documentation and demonstration of proper maintenance. If anything, an aircraft with extensive condition monitoring data is often a better risk than one that's just been overhauled by the lowest bidder with no historical tracking. Here's another critical element that separates the pilots who understand this system from those who don't. Engine management during flight. The way you operate your engine has an enormous impact on its longevity. Pilots who are consistently gentle on their engines, who properly manage temperatures, who lean correctly, who avoid shock cooling, and who follow best practices for starting and ground operations can dramatically extend engine life. Conversely, pilots who are aggressive with power changes, who run rich all the time, wasting fuel and washing cylinders, who don't manage CHTs properly, are going to see accelerated wear, regardless of how much they spend on maintenance. The pilots who never pay for overhauls aren't just benefiting from condition monitoring, they're operating their engines in a way that minimizes wear from day one. They're religious about preheating in cold weather. They're careful about power settings. They treat their engine like the expensive piece of machinery it is, not like a car engine that can tolerate abuse. There's also a philosophical shift that happens when you move to condition-based maintenance. And it's worth discussing because it affects everything about how you approach aircraft ownership. Traditional time-based maintenance is essentially a one-size-fits-all approach that assumes every engine and every operation is identical. It ignores the massive variability in how aircraft are used, maintained, and operated. A flight school aircraft doing pattern work with different students every day is going to experience completely different wear patterns than a privately owned aircraft doing cross-country flights with a single experienced pilot. Yet both are held to the same TBO number as if their engines are aging identically. Condition-based maintenance acknowledges reality. It says, let's look at what's actually happening with this specific engine, in this specific aircraft, with this specific operational profile, and make maintenance decisions based on data rather than guesswork. This is a more intelligent approach, and it's how virtually every other industry with expensive machinery operates. Now let me address the obvious question that's probably on your mind. Is this safe? And the answer is unequivocally yes, when done correctly. In fact, there's compelling evidence that it's often safer than blindly overhauling at TBO. Here's why. A properly monitored engine with consistent oil analysis, regular inspections, and documented trending data is less likely to have a surprise failure than an engine that's just been overhauled. New overhauls have a higher failure rate in the first 50 to 100 hours than mature engines that have been running reliably. This is well documented in the industry. Infant mortality is a real phenomenon with overhauled engines. Reassembly issues, parts that weren't properly broken in, tolerances that aren't quite right, these all contribute to increased risk immediately after overhaul. Meanwhile, an engine that's been running smoothly for 1,500 hours with clean oil analysis and good compression is a known quantity. You have data showing it's healthy. Which would you rather fly behind? The FAA actually supports condition-based maintenance through various programs and regulatory frameworks. Although most pilots don't realize this, the agency has consistently moved toward risk-based and data-driven approaches to safety. The entire concept of the FAA safety management system is built on using data to identify and mitigate risks rather than relying on rigid rules that may not address actual hazards. When you're doing regular oil analysis, detailed inspections, and making maintenance decisions based on actual engine condition, you're operating in alignment with modern safety philosophy. You're being proactive rather than reactive. You're preventing problems before they occur rather than waiting for a calendar to tell you it's time to spend money. Let me tell you what really happens at most overhaul shops, because this will open your eyes to why the smart operators are so selective about when and how they approach engine work. You bring your engine in at TBO and the shop tears it down completely. They inspect every part, measure everything, and then they give you a quote. In many cases, they're replacing parts that still have useful life remaining simply because that's the standard practice. Bearings that still have good clearances get replaced. Camshafts with minor wear get replaced. It's not necessarily because these parts are about to fail. It's because the shop wants to deliver an engine that meets certain standards, and they don't want comeback. From a business perspective, it makes sense for them. From your perspective as an aircraft owner, you're paying for new parts that you might not have needed for another 500 hours. And here's the kicker. All those parts they removed? Some of them get sold into the used parts market, where they're purchased by other owners for repairs. Think about that. Parts that were deemed not good enough for your overhauled engine are considered perfectly fine for someone else's engine repair. The path forward for pilots who want to adopt this approach requires a few critical elements. First, you need education. You need to understand the regulations, understand how engines age, and understand what monitoring data actually means. Second, you need to establish relationships. You need a mechanic who understands condition-based maintenance and is willing to work with you. Not all mechanics are comfortable with this approach, particularly if they're older and were trained in an era when TBO was treated as absolute. You may need to find someone younger or someone who has commercial aviation experience where condition monitoring is standard. Third, you need discipline. This approach only works if you're consistent with monitoring, rigorous with documentation, and honest about what the data is telling you. If you start seeing trends that indicate problems, you have to address them. You can't ignore warning signs just because you want to save money. Fourth, you need to accept that there's some nuance here. This approach isn't for everyone, and it works better with some engine types and operational profiles than others. But for many, probably most, Part 91 aircraft owners, it's a viable strategy that can save enormous amounts of money over the life of the aircraft. Here's the bottom line that I want you to walk away with. The traditional TBO-based overhaul cycle is not a regulatory requirement for Part 91 operations. It's not always the safest approach, and it's certainly not the most economical approach for informed aircraft owners. The pilots who have figured this out aren't cutting corners or taking risks. They're using data, monitoring closely, and making intelligent maintenance decisions based on actual engine condition rather than arbitrary time limits. They're following the same principles that commercial aviation has used successfully for decades, and they're saving tens of thousands of dollars in the process while potentially operating safer aircraft than those who blindly follow manufacturer recommendations without understanding the reasoning behind them. If you're an aircraft owner or aspiring to be one, understanding this alternative approach to engine maintenance could be one of the most valuable pieces of knowledge you gain. It requires effort, it requires discipline, and it requires a willingness to think differently than the conventional wisdom. But the financial rewards and the satisfaction of truly understanding your aircraft's condition make it absolutely worthwhile. The real question isn't why some pilots never pay for overhauls again. The real question is why more pilots aren't asking questions about a system that's been accepted without examination for so long.